Hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Realistically, a show where we deconstruct the current events of the week. Why am I echoing?
I don't
Okay.
know. You're. Oh, okay. So he's here. Do you want to?
Yeah. So let's bring in our guest, Q Anthony Ali. He is a journalist in Canada. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. So should we? So last week we spoke a little bit about Bree and Katie Halper, who got fired from their jobs for speaking out against Israel. And recently, you had something similar happen to you in Canada, which shows that it's a cross-border issue. Do you want to talk about what happened this week?
Oh boy. Yeah. Actually, I didn't even know that Katie Halper got fired. It's awful because she actually she sent me a note a couple of days ago when she heard what happened. But yeah, the issue was that Jesse Brown, who's somebody that I used to work for
Canada Land, right?
at Canada Land. Yeah, myself and my good friend Desmond Cole had a podcast together called Canada Land Commons, and uh, when uh, when Jesse received an email blast from the Canadian Association of Black Journalists
Uh-huh.
that mentioned the grant that they received, which enabled them to hire a new executive director, Jesse responded to the email blast and said, "Congratulations. Oh, and by the way, I was just checking your website and I noticed that Q Anthony Ali / Andre Demise is listed on your website as your board of directors. Is this still up to date, given his support of Hamas, among many other racist comments that he's made?"
Uh,
So,
I saw that tweet, and one of them was very. He deceptively edited one of the tweets so that didn't actually capture everything you said. Or did he do
well,
that?
I mean, he deceptively edited many of them, but that was after the fact. He just all he said to them was that I was supportive of Hamas and that I had made many other racist tweets. So I got a call from the chair of the board, and I didn't know what it was about. I assumed that it was because the grant that the CABJ had received enabled them to hire a paid executive director. So I thought she was calling me to update me about that news. But once she got past that little bit of nicety, she asked me about an email that she'd received, a very concerning email, um, saying that I support Hamas and that I made many racist comments. I said, "That's interesting. Who did they come from?" And she said, "Jesse Brown." I said, "Okay, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, Jesse Brown's upset at me because I have made statements saying that yeah, I hope Hamas wins, i.e., I hope that Hamas, along with the other coalition partners, the other four coalition partners in Gaza, were able to successfully resist the Israeli genocide against them." Now, that was about 5 days after the ground invasion of Gaza had begun. This was after the Al Shifa bombing. This was after schools, hospitals, mosques, churches, universities. This was after Gaza was already being leveled with
So this was
airstrikes.
so these comments happened sometime in late October or early November, right?
It was early November. I believe it was November 2nd, if I'm not mistaken.
Uh huh.
And the ground invasion of Gaza began on October 27th, I believe. So when I made that comment, it was in response to the problem that people were having with having to feel like they have to denounce Hamas every time they make a statement against the Israeli genocide. And I said, well, and my whole thing is, not only do you not have to denounce Hamas, because you shouldn't, that's absolutely ridiculous. You should hope for their victory. You should hope that they are able to successfully resist the genocide of the Palestinian people.
I've seen,
But
for example, so many people go on CNN, Piers Morgan, all these mainstream outlets, and they derailed the entire conversation from human rights
it's silly.
violations to do you denounce Hamas?
Well, I mean, they've on several occasions said that they welcome an investigation of their actions.
Uh-huh.
And as a matter of fact, they are. Uh, there is a warrant currently out. Uh, well, rather, there's a warrant being sought um, due to alleged violations of the Geneva Convention, war crimes, etc. But they've also said that they welcome such an examination. But when I said this to Nadia Chulmi, who's the chair of the Canadian Association of Black Journalists, she basically said, "Okay, well, that's all well and good, but my concern is for the integrity of the organization and our ability to fundraise." To which I said, "Okay, well, I'm not really sure what that has to do with anything. I mean, is our ability to fundraise in danger? Is the grant that we received going to be taken away?" She said, "Well, no, that's probably not the issue, but our ability to do so in the future might be in jeopardy." I said, "Okay, well, give me 24 hours to think about that. I'll get back to you tomorrow." And then I thought of something as soon as I hung up the phone, and I realized I don't even know if she asked Jesse for clarification. So I called her back and I said, "Hey, Nadia, just 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 off the top of my head, did you contact Jesse Brown and ask him for clarification as to what comments I had supposedly made that he could consider racist?" She said, "Well, no, I didn't do that, but I also don't want to get into the middle of it." I said, "Well, I'm very sorry about this because you shouldn't be, but you kind of are in the middle of it, quote unquote, because you're now an intermediary between Jesse and myself. But as a journalist, isn't it your job to figure out what the truth is here? I think it would be prudent to at least ask him for clarification on what it was exactly that he's alleging before you come and ask me about, hey, what is it that you said? You should also ask him, hey, Jesse, what is it that you mean?" So she does contact him, and he gets back to her and says, "Well, I don't have the alleged tweets with me right now, but here's one that he made, and I'm pretty sure he deleted it, but he hasn't apologized for it or made any further comment." Well, I didn't delete the tweet; it's still there. If if he had exercised maybe 10 seconds of diligence, he could have searched and found it, because that's what I sure did. So um, after forwarding me the message saying that, okay, well, here's the one message that Jesse found on you, is a screenshot of my tweet, um, but he didn't come up with anything else. I said, "Well, all right. I'm not. I don't think I should take any further action until we have a board meeting talking about this." So a board meeting was called. We did meet on this previous Sunday, and so the board asked me, "Well, okay, so what is it you meant by these tweets?" I said, "Well, I think that one of the board members asked me, like, okay, it's pretty concerning that you would support Hamas. I mean, they're a terrorist organization." To which I said, "Okay, well, Nkonto Wesizwe was a terrorist organization, or classified as such by the South African government, and Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist watch list for the United States until 2008. So what difference does that make? If during the apartheid era I'd expressed support for the African National Congress and for Nelson Mandela specifically, should that be a problem for Black journalists?" And I think the board began to understand that it is a little bit ridiculous to let the government dictate what speech we are and aren't able to exercise. Because if we have to accept government mandated norms as to what it is that we can or can't say, what we can or can't express support for, or at least our concerns about, then what is the point of having an association of Black journalists? We've just essentially not even been co-opted, but sold ourselves into the thrall of the government. The remainder of the board seemed to see it that way. They agreed by the end of the session that, without getting into too many details, I mean, by the end of the session, there weren't any concerns about what I had said. They said, well, I showed them some of the tweets, and they said, yeah, there shouldn't really be a conversation about him stepping down. So we left it at that. Maybe we're going to have a follow-up session to discuss our next steps, but there was no conversation about me stepping down. So after the board meeting, I posted, this was in the morning, I posted that Jesse had sent some emails trying and failing to put a wedge between myself and the Canadian Association of Black Journalists. I cropped out anything to do with Nadia's response to Jesse. There was only, and anything that had to do with Jesse's response that was not specifically about things that I had said online. Everything was cropped out. Even the CABG email address was cropped out. It was just, this is what Q said. Well, Nadia then contacted me later that day and asked how people were aware of what Jesse had said. I said, well, because I posted it. And she said, well, that's confidential information. I said, no, it's not. An email from an outsider, like from somebody who does not belong to the CABJ. Jesse's not part of the CABJ. He's not part of the black community. So if he sends a message to the CABJ about me, making an accusation about me, I think I have a right to respond. And I did, during the course of the board meeting, say that, okay, well, the CABJ doesn't have to say or do anything on my behalf. I will be the one responding to him. So I'm not sure what they thought I meant by that, but I did respond to him. And she said it was private CABJ information. It wasn't. So she called for another board meeting immediately, and I was not invited to the board meeting. So I saw the email that went out saying that we should have a board meeting, but then when people were indicating what their availability would be, there was no follow up. So when they actually scheduled the meeting, I wasn't invited to it. Now, normally, what one would expect is that at the board meeting, the person that is under question should be invited and should be able to speak for themselves, but I wasn't. I'm not even sure how many people were even invited. Another board member mentioned that when they got the invitation to the meeting, to which I wasn't invited, it was, instead of it being CC'd to all the board members, it was BCC'd. So it was blind yeah, it was blind carbon copy. Okay, and I was not part of that email chain, so none of them knew which of the others had actually been invited to that meeting. I can't prove this, but my suspicion is that only, I would say, probably just enough of them to make quorum, or perhaps even fewer, were actually invited to the meeting. And of those ones, I'm assuming that maybe they made quorum with 3 people. I don't see how, because based on the people that were there that said we don't think any further action should be taken. So based on the people that were there, I'm not really sure how they could have achieved quorum to take a complete 180 position that my comments were racist and that necessitated me being removed from the board. So I got a call the very next day. I wasn't even aware the meeting had taken place. I'd actually sent a message saying, hey guys, like, when are we having this meeting? And then Nadia calls me back the next day and says, oh yeah, we actually did have the meeting on Tuesday night. We took a vote and we decided to remove you from the board because your comments are harmful to the Jewish community, and support for Hamas, a terrorist organization, is not acceptable. I said, Nadia, that's not what you guys were saying at the board meeting on Sunday night. And she says, that's what the decision was. We thank you for your service, yada yada yada. I said, oh, okay, I get it. This is a captured organization. This is just a rent-seeking NGO that doesn't actually have a membership, that doesn't actually take the concerns of Black Canadian journalists into account. None of the Black journalists that have been either fired or sidelined for their support of Palestinians against the Israeli genocide, none of them have been spoken up for by the CABJ, and I'm just another one. I get it. So the announcement was made to the CABJ board members, and then Jesse Brown was simultaneously informed. Jesse Brown knew that I was ousted from the board before I did.
Wow, that seems a little
on top of that, the communication that went out about my ousting, okay, that was open. But then the communication that went to me about me being removed from the board was labeled private and confidential, as if I'm supposed to keep it confidential, even though I had already been removed from the board. The reason that they said that I was removed from the board was for breach of trust. And the breach of trust was that I had published the email that Jesse sent, but the item under which the breach of trust would have occurred was a commitment to keep the details of board meetings confidential, which I fully agreed to. Jesse's email to the board does not constitute any part of a board meeting. Jesse is not a member of the board. He's not a member of the CABJ. He's not a member of the Black community. So if I publish what he said to the CABJ, again, of which at the time I was a board member, that's not kept in any sort of confidentiality of a. That's not part of a board meeting.
No.
That's an external email to the board. The details of the board meeting, I said nothing about those details. So that all being said, yep, I was removed for so basically, if a white person emails the Canadian Association of Black Journalists making a very very inflammatory allegation about any of its members or of its board of directors, and that person says something about it, then the CABJ will not only not protect you, they'll actually distance themselves from you.
Yeah, that I wish I could say this is unique, but this seems to happen with alarming frequency. And often I've seen tweets where members, pro-Israel members, are like, "We stood by the Black community during the civil rights movement, therefore you owe us
Oh,
to
of course,
stand."
yeah.
And so so there is a kind of a entitlement. Like a quid pro. I don't know how to explain it. Like
It's
people
not even a
should.
quid pro quo. It's even worse than that. They forgot that we got our freedom papers. That's exactly how I would describe it.
Yeah, exactly, and and I've like seen they always seems to extra target the Black community for BS.
Well, of course, this has been going on for the past couple of years, especially. This went on during the early years of the prominence of the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan. Ever since Louis Farrakhan in the 1980s began criticizing the state of Israel for its theft from Palestinians and its wanton murder, which I believe even at that time constituted genocidal actions. When Louis Farrakhan began speaking about the state of Israel and the horrific crimes of which that it was conducting, this was well after the Sabra and Shatila massacre. This is well after the 6 Day War. After all of that, when Louis Farrakhan began criticizing the state of Israel, that's when he picked up a reputation as a hateful anti-Semite. This is pretty much what always happens. Anytime that Black people are critical of the state of Israel, this is where we wind up. And the issue is, and I've said this many times in my tweets, the anti-Semitism that European Jews were subjected to by other Europeans, by white Europeans, which had nothing to do with us, had nothing to do with Black people, had nothing to do with Arabic people, had nothing to do with Muslim people broadly. All of that gets displaced on us as if we did something to them. When in fact, and I've been very explicit about this, there is a community of Sephardic Jews that were expelled from Spain and Portugal, generally on the Iberian Peninsula.
Mhm.
Everyone knows about the pogroms of 1492. So at the same time that Christopher Columbus was at the same time Christopher Columbus was coming back from his voyages to the Caribbean, there were Jewish people that were being expelled from Spain. Many of them went eastwards towards the Ottoman Empire, but many others went west into the quote unquote New World.
Mhm.
And many of them wound up in Brazil. So in Recife, in Bahia, where at the time the Dutch had colonized portions of Brazil, Jewish people were safe with the Dutch. Now, granted, they weren't integrated into every area of the economy, but their largest income from those communities came from tax farming, i.e., collecting taxes on behalf of the Dutch government and being able to collect a profit on it for their work, collecting the taxes in the first place. And then the second largest source of income was the slave trade. So African slaves that were being imported from West Africa were traded by Jewish communities in Brazil. That's where many of them made their money from. That's where the community wealth was built from. So of course, not every Jewish person participated in it, but the wealth that was coming into the community was accelerated by the slave trade.
Mhm.
When the Portuguese were able to remove the Dutch and capture all of Brazil's territories, where did they go? Back to Spain? No, they went to other Caribbean islands. Many of them ended up in Jamaica. So the largest slave trading port in the Caribbean at the time was Port Royal, which no longer exists. Port Royal was destroyed in an earthquake in 1689. But the majority, I'd have to go back and look at the exact numbers, but when I say majority, I'm not exaggerating here. I mean the percentage-wise and numerical majority of slave trading that took place in Port Royal, majority of it was conducted by those very same Sephardic Jewish families that had been expelled from Brazil by the Portuguese. After 1689, when Port Royal sank into the ocean in an earthquake, you can literally go to Port Royal now. You can go swim in the Caribbean Sea and see Port Royal underwater. So if you're a scuba diver, you can actually go and visit the monuments underwater that had sunk into the ocean after the earthquake. But the people who were able to survive the earthquake and rebuild, they moved into Kingston. So Kingston then became the largest slave trading port in the area. At least it was Britain's largest slave trading port. Many of them went to Barbados as well. And so Kingston, I believe it was 20% of the population of Kingston were Jewish people at the time. Many Ashkenazis came after the fact. They built at the time they were able to build synagogues in a very healthy and thriving community. But again, and this wasn't they weren't enabled to do tax farming by the British. The taxes were collected by by British treasurers and went directly to the crown.
Mm-hmm.
So their number one source of income in the community was slave trading, and 30%. So this was actually a large shift. Rather than simply participating in the trade of slaves,
Mm-hmm.
at this time, uh, the Sephardic Jewish community began participating in the actual plantation economy, such that by 1831, which was the last slave rebellion in Jamaica, fully 30% of Jamaica's plantations were controlled by Jewish families.
Oh
As a
wow.
matter of fact, my own ancestors that were brought into Jamaica
Uh-huh.
um, were traded by Jewish traders, and at least some of at least some of my relatives were working on Jewish plantations. A couple of them for the Gabe family, which was the largest plantation owning Jewish family in the country. When I mention these things, people get extremely upset about that, and that I'm singling Jewish people out. Now, on many occasions, I've said, no, here are some misconceptions. People think that Jewish people financed the slave trade. That's absolutely not true. At least not for Britain. Most of the financing was done by the crown and by Scottish like private financiers.
Mm-hmm.
So Jewish finance had actually very little to do with the Caribbean slave trade, at least in the British territories. The French, they certainly weren't allowing, with the gyrations happening between the monarchy and the revolution. They weren't able to participate that much in the
Uh-huh.
French slave economy. It was mostly in, at the time, the British slave economy. So their ability to raise finances was mostly kept inside the community. It certainly was not financing the voyages, etc. There were some large benefactors, but they made up a very small percentage. But when it comes to the actual plantation economy, no,
Mm-hmm.
30% of them, 30% of the plantation land ownership was actually from Jewish families. And people act as if, well, that doesn't mean every Jewish person was participating, which is the very same argument as not not every white person was participating in the American plantation economy and slave trade. Of course they weren't. But the economy itself was powered by the slave trade, by the exploited labor and all of the crops and manufactured goods that came out of that time period. So of course there were secondary and tertiary economies that were built off of the slave trade. And the reason I bring this up so often is because all we ever get to hear from Jewish people, where it comes to their relationship with Black people, is that, well, we helped you out during the civil rights era. To which I say, yeah, okay, that's all well and good, but how can you claim credit for the Jewish community when you're talking about the civil rights era? So all Jews get to claim collective credit for the civil rights era. But where it comes to the slave trade, all of a sudden we have to be very, very specific about which Jews participated. And yet, as a numerical percentage, I mean, it's just plain and simple. Numerically, more Jewish people participated in the slave trade and the plantation economy than there were people who assisted during the civil rights era. That's just an incontrovertible fact. So why did Jewish people get credit for one, but have to then limit us in our criticisms of the other? Do I think that all Jewish people are to blame for that? Of course not. But I find it incredibly condescending and downright racist that we have to parse our words so very carefully, especially as a Black journalist working for or working with an organization that purports to represent Black journalists, that if I veer a tiny bit outside of the language barriers, that I get removed by the board. Now, the part that really bothered me was finding out that the grant that enabled the CABJ
Mm-hmm.
to hire the paid executive director, it was a $35,000 grant provided by the Foundation for Black Communities Canada. Now, getting that grant, anybody who works in fundraising knows if you get one significant grant, you will then very likely be able to get other significant grants
Mm-hmm.
because it shows that you have larger institutional trust. The problem is, if you get funding from an organization like FFBC or Heritage Canada, it is very easy for the government of Canada to then cut those purse strings if any of the language from a board member or a member that the organization stands up for, communications, etc., if any of that falls within the red zone of the IHRA guidelines,
Uh-huh.
International Holocaust Remembrance Association, well, their guidelines for the definition of anti Semitism also include criticisms of Israel. So, for example, if you liken the policies of the Israeli government to Nazi Germany, well, then that's just hate speech, right?
Wow.
So it's not even Holocaust.
We interviewed a professor a few weeks ago, and he talked about how in his university they changed the definition of anti-Semitism in order to target him. And I wonder if they used this definition. Wait, you're muted. No. Okay. I can't hear you. Janet, maybe, can you help? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. All right, so probably he'll come back in.
Okay. Yeah. So he was getting to a really interesting part about this. Remember when we interviewed David? What's his last name? Miller.
Yes.
He talked about how they changed the definition of anti-Semitism in order to target him.
Yeah. No, they're definitely, changing the rules, changing things up to punish people who are against Israel and what they're doing. So.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Q, let's bring up another interesting topic that I kind of unraveled about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
That the U.S. government officially admitted to.
Let me pull this. Oops. Let me pull it up. I'm not. Oh, he's back.
Oh, he's back. Okay, let's do that later then.
Okay. Okay.
Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you very well now.
Sorry about that. I lost power to my headphones.
No worries.
Switched to my AirPods. Okay, yeah. So sorry.
We were talking about the definition of anti-Semitism by International Holocaust Remembrance
Association. Yeah.
Yeah, and they include any criticism of Israel as part of anti-Semitism, right?
Well, specifically, if you make, for example, allusions, let's say that you make an allusion to policies of the government of Israel that are similar to that of the Nazi government, the Nazi regime. The issue is, I mean, if you see Palestinian bodies being bulldozed, that you see that their bodies are being desecrated, that they're being dumped into mass graves, that they're being tortured, that they're being herded into concentration camps, etc., that they're being dehumanized, photographed, sexually assaulted. I mean, these are all this process of brutalization, dehumanization. Even somebody like Hannah Arendt was very clear that in the process of what she calls brutalization, and that doesn't mean doing brutal things to people. What she means is inflicting harm upon people in such a way, in such a graphic and open way, that it causes those who commit that violence, as well as people who witness that violence, to become desensitized to violence against those kinds of people. So then by removing their humanity, or at least removing people's ability to feel sympathy for that group of people, it makes it easier to commit acts of wanton murder and violence against those people. Even Hannah Arendt recognized that. And I mean, Hannah Arendt was sleeping with Heidegger. So if you make simple observations that even Hannah Arendt was making, then you could actually be accused of anti-Semitism. And that's exactly what happened. So for an organization like CABJ, I mean, they're essentially they're handcuffed, because you can't actually be protected as a Black journalist since the organization is dependent on fundraising and dependent on funds from a government that does abide by those guidelines. Well, what that means is you actually are not able to speak freely. You're not able to criticize the government of Israel. You will be labeled an anti-Semite. And the problem is, so now we have an organization for Black people, ostensibly by Black people, but its ability to perform the basic functions of its existence are dependent on an outside community to work. And on top of that, on the board of directors, there are people that I've seen making pro-Zionist comments. I'm not gonna mention their names. I don't think it's exactly fair to hold people to certain, like, just because they express certain political points of view does not mean that their political points of view interfere with their ability to conduct their work. However, There's one that I'm very comfortable saying absolutely not. She is an out-and-out Zionist and has used her influence to pressure Black communities into borderline Islamophobic positions, and that's Marlene Jennings, who used to be a member of Parliament for the Liberal government of Canada. And Marlene Jennings is not only an ardent Zionist who has made many comments that I would consider to be bigoted against Palestinians and Islamophobic, but on top of that, her husband, and you got to check his name out. So her husband's name is Luciano Del Negro.
Mm-hmm.
Luciano Del Negro, meaning it's Italian for of the blacks.
Yeah.
Luciano Del Negro, he's not a Black person. He is the former vice president of the Quebec branch of CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs of Canada.
Is that like IPAC in Canada?
It's basically, it performs the same functions as APAC. So CIJA is the lobby organization that keeps the Canadian government in line as far as making sure that our support collectively as a government and as a country, that Canada's support of Israel is steadfast. It almost doesn't matter what Israel does, the government of Canada, if it's being lobbied properly by CIJA, there's no daylight between the two. So one of CIJA's strongest soldiers in the federal government, for example, Anthony Housefather, who's a member of the Liberal caucus, Anthony Housefather will essentially send down marching orders to the rest of the caucus and say, this is what you have to say. If you don't follow these specific instructions, if you don't say these specific things, then not only is your caucus membership in danger, but if you're not a member of the Liberal caucus, we will simply label you as an anti-Semite. Anthony Housefather, who is one of the most rabid Zionists that exists in Canadian government, a friend of mine, Dimitri Lascaris, criticized Anthony Housefather and said, well, where are your loyalties to the government of Canada or the government of Israel? Because it seems like you're riding the fence here. Are the interests of Canada and Israel the same to you? Or do you have an interest in representing the people in your parliamentary district, in your riding? Or is your constituency that of Israel? Now, Dimitri didn't exactly say that, but that's the distinction that he was essentially trying to make. And for that, this is at the time that Dimitri was running for the leader of the Green Party of Canada. Because he said that, not only was he labeled an anti-Semite by Justin Trudeau and by Anthony Housefather, of course, and by the Liberals, he was also labeled an anti-Semite by Jagmeet Singh, which is the reason why, even though I knew Jagmeet Singh long before he ever ran for federal office, I first met Jagmeet Singh briefly before he ran for office at the provincial level, because he represented my grandmother's riding. Jagmeet Singh, who I thought of as a very thoughtful and intelligent person, denounced Dimitri Lascaris as an anti-Semite, and then his own caucus inside the Green Party denounced him as an anti-Semite, and that caused the victory of Enemy Paul, who was also a rabid Zionist, who supported the Bolivian coup, who supported the genocide of Palestinians. She supports Israel's actions, has never criticized them. She ends up winning the party leadership, and then within about 18 months, gone. Her Zionism was too much even for the very same party that supported her over Dimitri.
Wow.
So, so getting back to CIJA, like that's what the purpose of CIJA is to ensure that any public discussion about these actions of the state of Israel align to that of the government of Israel. And that's the husband of Marlene Jennings. Marlene Jennings is on the board of the Foundation for Black Canadians. Foundation for Black Canadians is the organization that is tasked with providing funding for organizations, nonprofit organizations, like the Canadian Association of Black Journalists. Essentially, they're like the bag holders for the federal government that disperses funds out to Black organizations. But because Marlene Jennings sits on the board, it's inherently tainted. So the taint here is that any organization, any nonprofit that is hoping to receive funds from the FFBC essentially has to handcuff its membership and its board, has to muzzle them, because if you say something that's out of line with what CIJA wants, you will lose your funding.
Well, that actually sounds more intense than what IPAC does.
I mean, I would say it's pretty much to the same degree, right? The exact, I mean, the same The same almost exists for the United States, but not quite. There's a joint House resolution and a Senate resolution that is trying to make that happen, i.e., the resolution. I forget the exact number for the resolution, but it's sponsored in the House by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and then there's a whole whack of co-founders to the bill. And what it is that they're going to have the federal government adopt the IHRA language so that any institution of higher education or nonprofit institutions, etc., if they're aware of speech, whether it's by like student protesters, by faculty, fundraising organizations, etc., their responsibility is to clamp down on any speech that violates the IHRA guidelines. Otherwise, they can lose funding from the federal government. So, not like the U.S. is not quite there, but functionally it already is.
Yeah, functionally it is there, but yeah. And one thing, just curiosity, did Seja ever make a comment when, say, members of the Waffen SS were invited to the Canadian Parliament?
No, I mean, as far as I'm aware, Seja did not have any comments about. You're referring to Yaroslav Hunka.
Yep.
Who was the Waffen SS member that spoke on the floor of the House of Commons?
Yeah,
and then received the standing ovation. Yeah.
Yeah, and in his blog, he literally said the years between 1941 and 1945 was the best years of his life.
Yeah, there was no comment from Seja. As far, I mean, at least as far as I remember. I've even been on their website. I don't recall ever seeing a comment from Seja on that. So.
Yeah, I mean, and the anti-Semitism coming from the UPA was so intense that German Nazis actually complained about it. Like I mean,
not only complained, and I should really get back to writing. I've just been so busy in the past couple of years, and also just so disgusted with like the state of media that I haven't really had any confidence in me writing anything. It's like, is this actually making a difference, or am I just like speaking to the wind? Am I just putting a message in a bottle? But this is something that I had like tweeted about quite often, which was that, and it's even if you look in, I believe it was John Paul Hemke that wrote about this. It was a book. It was about the OUNB nationalists. I forget the exact title, but it's by John Paul Hemke. It is a book about the OUNB. John Paul Hemke is actually the uncle of Chrystia Freeland. He was the one that. John Paul Hemke was also the one that exposed in one of his books that Chrystia Freeland's grandfather was the publisher of Krakisti Visti, which was a Nazi sympathetic publication run by an OUNB outfit, and that the press that published that newspaper was seized from a Jewish family that was persecuted during the Holocaust. So John Paul, that information that we have actually came from John Paul Hemke, who's Chrystia Freeland's uncle. And yeah, in his book about the OUNB, he talked about, for example, like the massacre of Jews in Ukraine, because in Poland it was mostly Galician Poles, but in Ukraine it was mostly of Jews, and that the crimes against Jewish people were so gruesome. Jewish people, like Jewish Ukrainians, ran away from the OUNB into the arms of the Nazis, and even the Nazis were like, "What the fuck is wrong with you guys?"
Yeah,
I'm talking about like hanging women and cutting the fetuses from their wombs, type of gruesome crimes, like leaving the entrails of their victims like festooned across branches in the forest. It was some of the most gruesome shit you could possibly imagine. And yeah, that's what the OUNB was doing. So this guy, who's a member of the Galician Waffen SS, a Nazi sympathetic organization that was a branch of the OUNB, said that those years, especially in which he was just killing Jews, those were some of the best years of his life.
Yeah. And it shows you the disingenuity of the anti-Semitism claim in that they're not worried about people who've actually committed horrific crimes against the Jews, but they're more worried about individual journalists, people speaking on behalf of Palestinians.
Yep, absolutely. Well, here's the thing: is they want to be able to replicate those crimes, to do the exact same thing to Palestinians. I mean, you can read about what the Stern Gang, in the late 1930s and 1940s, what the Stern Gang was doing.
What is the Stern Gang?
Palestine.
For people who
The
know.
The Stern Gang was an Israeli militia,
Uh-huh.
mostly composed of Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews
Uh-huh.
that settled in the Palestinian territory. This was after the Palestinian Mandate was granted to a future state of Israel under the Balfour Declaration. And in order to make room, in order to conduct their own little Lebensraum, they wandered across the countryside, just attacking villages and massacring people. The Irgun Squad was doing the exact same thing. They were conducting a campaign of ethnic cleansing. This is prior to the Nakba. And those militias were folded into the IDF after the formation of the IDF when the UN took a vote in 1948 and enabled Israel to exist as a recognized country. Well, those militias, including Stern Gang and the Irgun militia, they were all folded into the IDF generally. So that's what their precursors are. People talk about, for example, like Meir Kahane and his campaign of violence, but you have to understand, even people like David Ben Gurion were on these death squads. People see David Ben Gurion as this sort of a saintly figure, a founding father of Israel, but even he was on these death squads. And the interesting thing is that many of these people, Ehud Olmert, even Ariel Sharon, I mean, these people were all part of these militias or part of the IDF that came out of these militias. And even they were saying, guys, the shit that you're doing is it's unconscionable. The things that the IDF are doing now, like even those people who are conducting extermination campaigns, even they were saying we're going a little bit too far now.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you see, I mean, the other day I saw this picture where this had like all these Palestinians were on the floor, half naked, they were tied up, and this guy was like opening up the scripture and praying, and it was very, very jarring to me.
It's disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah. And all these photos of them like doing underwear raids and playing with children's toys. All of it? It shows you like the
they put on the the lingerie and garments of women that they've murdered. It's pretty sick stuff.
Yeah,
and they parade it in front of the camera like it's a big joke. Their commanding officers are on camera. I mean, this is probably like the worst troop discipline that I've ever seen, because even if you are going to carry out these activities, what you don't want to do is actually record it and then publish it so that the entire rest of the world can see what you're doing. I mean, even that basic bit of troop discipline, which is to at least hide your war crimes, that's out the window. They're recording it and publishing it for the world to see, as if everybody else at the rest of the world is actually seeing this and agreeing with it.
I wonder why they do it, because it seems like do they not understand how the rest of the world interprets this, or do they not care?
I don't think they care. They don't care. At least that's what they say. They don't care. I mean, anybody who's hit that translate button, I don't read Hebrew. I don't speak Hebrew. But anybody who hits the translate button on a tweet that comes out from your average Israeli about this conflict is seeing some of the most Nazi shit they've ever seen in their life. I would actually venture to argue that your average German probably didn't have these kinds of sentiments.
It's hard for me to say what the average German had, but we do know with public opinion polls that overwhelming majority of Israelis do support these actions. Okay. Oh, by the way, let me quickly get.
Because what I'm saying is the average German wasn't even aware that many of these war crimes were taking place. So I don't know that the average German was could see these kinds of crimes and say, yeah, we're okay with this. I mean, certainly during the Nuremberg trials, they were all saying, well, oh no, we never approved of anything like this. But of course, that's what you want to say.
That's what you're going to say during Nuremberg.
Yeah, you don't want to find yourself at the defendant's bench at the time. But I just don't think that the average German was even aware that some of these activities were taking place. They couldn't have been, because the death camps were far removed away from urban German society at the time.
Yeah, but there were 25 million people in the Wehrmacht, so a big portion knew about it. Okay, let me get.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm referring to civilians, but yeah, you get the idea.
Yeah. So somebody said Malcolm X called this media and rhetorical type. The Final Forest in 1980. Malcolm X called this media and rhetorical type of distortion the white man's technology.
I mean, You really don't want me to get into Nation of Islam and technology stuff, right? I'm in enough trouble as it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody else said, Power Trip said serial killer activity.
I mean, I'm not really sure what you want me to say. You obviously can't see the New York Times report that came out last week. And even the New York Times couldn't whitewash this one. They hid these details at the very end of the article rather than leading with it, but it was there about a hospital, which was essentially,
A
it was a
torture
death camp.
chamber.
It was a death camp. It was a torture chamber. But nurses at this hospital and female staff members at this hospital were torturing Palestinian prisoners. They were shocking them with tasers and like the chalk rods, and literally heating up pieces of metal, which I assume to be like rebar, lifting the prisoners bodily, and then putting them down on these like superheated pieces of rebar, such that they were anally penetrated by them. They were sodomizing Palestinian men with hot pokers.
That's disgusting. Okay. So,
You've never heard of any hostage being released or being recaptured that has told a story anything like this.
No, one hostage said that Hamas cynically made them birthday cake.
I know. I mean, that's also coming out of, I forget, was it the Jerusalem Post?
It was one of the yeah, but it's funny. The other hostage literally said that Hamas became a human shield and covered their so that the fire wouldn't fall on them.
Sure. Yeah. And basically, like, there's nothing. First of all, when they say it's Hamas, we don't know whether or not they're referring to Hamas soldiers. It
Or
could be the PFLP. It could be any of these, because there's five coalition members that have come together to form the Palestinian resistance, but they're all just cynically referred to generally as Hamas because that's the name that Westerners generally know. But they're even saying that this Al Jazeera journalist was a member of Hamas. Like, this is so when they say Hamas, you just have to take that with not even just a grain of salt. You may as well just eat the whole box of salt. But yeah, that's the Palestinians who do decent and humane things like shield their captives, shield their. I'm not going to defend that because they are kidnapping people as part of a retaliation campaign is still a war crime.
Yeah.
But going to the extent that you're going to shield them from harm with your own bodies, and then that gets described as some sort of cynical act. Sure, whatever.
Okay. The other one, Mr. I says, I feel the settler militia members of the IDF feel they must genocide the Palestinian people to get away with their project of taking Gaza.
I'm sorry, I missed what you just said there.
Okay. I feel the settler militia members of the IDF feel they must genocide the Palestinian people to get away with their projects of taking Gaza.
What else could be the end goal here? You literally have commanding officers saying that exact same thing. It's not a matter of getting away with. Like, that's just the intention, is to cleanse the people of Gaza. To cleanse the Amaleks, as they say, the Amaleks from the land. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Bible.
Not at all familiar.
I was raised a Baptist Christian, and due to spending a lot of time in Sunday schools, I am very familiar with the story of the massacre of the Amalekites. Okay, the people of Amalek. They're basically saying that there has to be wanton slaughter in order to claim the promised land. Now, you got to keep in mind, in the Old Testament, it's just very funny because with the amount of atheists that exist in Israeli society, I find it interesting that at times they kind of waver between secular and religious doctrine as it suits them. But one thing that people refer to is the birthright ownership of the state of Israel. But even according to the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, the people of Israel, that is the people of Samaria and Judea, they didn't just spring up in the land out of the blue. God didn't create them there. They had to find the promised land, and they had to cleanse the inhabitants. They had to cleanse the Canaanites from the land in order to claim it. So even in the Torah, it does not say that was originally Israeli land, that they're indigenous to the region. Even in the Torah, the holy book of the Jewish people, it explicitly states that in order to claim the land of Israel, in order to claim Judea and Samaria, they had to conduct an ethnic cleansing campaign of the Canaanites.
Oh wow. So when Netanyahu talks about the children of light, is that a different story? The children of light and the children of darkness story?
I mean, that's you can refer to that as like the story of. You can refer to to the story of Cain. You can refer to that as in the book of Genesis. There's the sons of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael. The sons of Isaac are generally referred to as the Jewish people, and the sons of Ishmael would eventually go on to become the Muslims. Because remember, Islam doesn't come into existence until the 700s AD. But the children of Ishmael, that is the children who did not accept the Lord their God as the Lord their God, that had gone on to worship other gods. The children of Ishmael are the Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, there is no biblical justification for any of this. It kind of relies on people's biblical ignorance. But the thing is, their holy book is also our holy book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are books that are missing. There are books. There are books of the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not the original five, like the first five books of the Torah. I mean, that's the same in both religions, but they're reading it in the original Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
We're reading a translation of a translation of a translation, right? So we're not reading it in Hebrew. We're reading it in English. It went from Hebrew to translate it into Aramaic, to translate it into to Latin, to translate it to English. So we're reading like a copy of a copy of a copy. There's much that's being lost in translation, but at the very same time, we have the information right there. In fact, there are direct Hebrew to English translations that are available. You can read them on the internet, and all of them say the exact same thing. This territory is, maybe it was promised to them by the God that we call Allah,
Mm-hmm.
and the God that they call God. Or at least there's many names for God in the Hebrew language. But all being said, the land was promised to them, but it wasn't owned by them to begin with.
Mm-hmm. So then they had, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, Power Trip says, yes, the Zionism was always a dishonest interpretation of the Torah in an attempt to justify their colonial conquest.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually kind of untrue. So so Theodor Herzl was essentially the premier architect of Zionist policy, or at least the idea that there should be a holy land that is colonized by the Jewish people and for the Jewish people. I mean, Theodor Herzl was an atheist, right? And many of the Jewish elites, and it wasn't even just Jewish people; it was many Christians as well, in the West and in Eastern Europe. Their project was not composed of regular working class Jewish people. That project was composed by the elite of both societies. Most working class Jewish people at the time, and Norman Finkelstein writes extensively about this in his book, The Holocaust Industry. Regular working class Jewish people in like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, etc., they didn't have any connection to the land of Israel. They had a connection to the land where they grew up. They had a connection to Chicago, Philadelphia, Newark, wherever. And they didn't want to have a land in a country that they had never been to in their entire lives, that they knew nothing about, that was out in the Middle East, a place whose language, like, nobody speaks the Arabic language. At least, like, even if you were like a first generation or second generation immigrant from Germany, Poland, France, wherever, you weren't familiar with the Arabic language,
Mm-hmm.
generally. Your language was German, Polish, French, Ukrainian, whatever it might be. So most people had no connection, either emotionally, linguistically, maybe to some degree spiritually, maybe, but this was just an idea at the time. For most Jewish people, it was just not on their radar. So if you say that there's a country over here that we're going to promise you that you will be safe, the question is, well, why can't I be safe right here where I live? Why do I have to go over there? Why Why are you going to uproot me again and put me into this land in a region that I don't know about, I've never been to, and I've only heard about in the Bible or in the Torah? It was the elites who were creating essentially a forward operating base for Western interests. And the promise was that it was a place where Jewish people were going to be safe. But just like Theodor Herzl said, and this is why he was willing to collaborate with the Nazis, the enmity that European people have for the Jews is actually the best ally for the state of Israel, because Jewish people feel like they have to go somewhere that they can actually be safe. So if they are safe where they are, then they have no incentive to move to Israel. But if they feel very unsafe, if we can make conditions that make them unsafe, then we will want to go there. And this is, for example, why the state of Israel, even after the state of Israel was created as a nation in 1948, and until the 1960s, the region was underpopulated by Jewish people. If you look at the population maps, where it's all populations of Jewish-speaking people inside of the state of Israel, or the borders of Israel, is far outnumbered by the number of Arabs that live in the region. So what do? They conduct terror campaigns. They conduct fear-mongering campaigns in other countries, in Iraq, in Egypt, Syria, etc. And the idea is, if you begin to make the Mizrahim who live in those countries feel unsafe, where else are they going to go but the state of Israel? And after these terror campaigns and after these fear-mongering campaigns are launched in other countries, then you see a flood of Jewish people come into the country. As a matter of fact, it was so drastic, and it was of such horrific import, that those countries, Iraq, Egypt, etc., had to make laws preventing Jewish people from leaving. They had to be smuggled out.
Yeah.
So people act as if Arabic countries kicked them out. I mean, sure, was there persecution? Was there discrimination? Even I would say oppression? Yes, absolutely. There was. There was quite a bit of ethnic tension. There was even a degree of ethnic hatred. That was absolutely true. But look what was happening just around the corner from them. I'm not going to say, can you blame them? Because of course you can. But this doesn't begin to happen until after the formation of the State of Israel. It wasn't an already existing condition within majority Arab-speaking countries. This was a condition that was created after the State of Israel was formed.
Exactly, and they tried to do the same exact thing with the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union basically liberated all but 2 concentration camps and made anti-Semitism illegal. Like, the Soviet Union had a large Jewish population, and in the 1970s they tried to do this psyop that tried to claim that the same people who liberated every concentration camp were suddenly anti-Semitic, and that was just not true. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the economic conditions became so bad, many Jews went to Israel.
I think it is fair to say that there was a significant amount of anti-Semitism.
Hopefully he'll be back. Hello?
Sorry, you there? Sorry about that.
Yep.
Hello?
Yeah, we're here.
Sorry, just got a phone call. I think it's fair to say there was a significant amount of anti-Semitism that existed within the USSR, but I don't think that any fair person could say that there was a campaign of that there were state organized pogroms that took place.
Of course not.
Yeah, that's the stories that we hear. But I think it's also a little bit of idealism to say that anti-Semitism was not a problem in the USSR. It absolutely was. But it's essentially after the formation of the State of Israel that the dominoes begin to fall.
Exactly. This is okay. One more comment. European anti-Semitism was propagated by the Catholic Church that wished to monopolize Christianity. Absolutely, Catholic Church collaborated with the Nazis.
You got to keep in mind. It was the Catholic Church. It was the Pope that had to convince. They had to convince the Gaul to support the formation of the State of Israel. Without the Pope essentially pleading with the Gaul, France probably wouldn't have supported the UN mandate that formed the creation of the State of Israel. And the way that you know that this is true, if anybody cares to look at the map and look at Jordan's eastern borders, so look at the eastern, not the western border, not the West Bank, obviously. Look at the eastern border of Jordan and tell me how weird that looks to you.
It looks kind of like
And then
like a pentagon.
it's a big little. It's like a panhandle jutting
Yeah.
up into the east. Okay. Now, what is the country immediately to the north of that panhandle? What is the country immediately to the south of that panhandle?
Iraq,
And
south
north of it, north of that panhandle,
is Lebanon.
Jordan. Okay, and then south of it,
I don't know. I don't know.
what's south of that panhandle?
I don't know.
Look it up. Look it up on the map. I want your viewers to see this.
Okay, let me see.
Now, Jordan is actually north of Israel. It's not north of
Okay,
north
south of the
Egyptian border.
panhandle is Saudi Arabia. Let me see if I can share this.
Okay, and then north of the panhandle.
Hold
It's
on.
not Lebanon. Yeah, it's not Lebanon. Lebanon's north of Israel. So it's like a promontory jutting out on the eastern side of Jordan. Okay,
Yeah.
Syria.
Syria, there is a
And
panhandle.
Saudi. Okay.
Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia.
Okay. Now, if you look from Israel to Jordan to Iraq, what's east of Iraq?
Iran,
And east of Iran,
Afghanistan, and Pakistan.
there's a body of water. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, the Gulf of the Persian Gulf.
Persian Gulf. Okay. So from Israel to the Persian Gulf, keep in mind these are all British-controlled territories. Okay. So the formation of the state of Israel gives the British access from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. That's what the strategic importance of Israel was to the British at the time and to the Americans. The French had to be persuaded into that because those formerly French-controlled territories, especially, Syria to the north, that was formerly a French colony. So France said, okay, well, what is the purpose of us signing this declaration? All it does is cut our own throats. It means that we don't have an economic zone to move goods from one side of the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. But you get that, Britain. That's why France had to be moved. That's why the Catholic Church had to persuade France into signing the UN Declaration.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah. And so, okay, before we wrap up, how do people find you, and what are you up to? What are you planning on working on next?
I mean, right now I'm focused on my own work. Like the stuff that I do, the board work that I was doing with the TABJ, I'm gonna say was very minimal. I was helping with the organization just until it could become self-sufficient. Until they had solid sources of funding that they could become like an established organization. But yeah, I haven't been writing mainstream for a couple of years. I've actually just been keeping to myself mostly. I mean, you can find me on Twitter, NobleQLE. I've been considering opening a Substack for a little while now. I might not. I don't know. You can generally find me on Twitter, and if I get into anything else, I will let you know.
Okay. Somebody said great guest. Do you want to quickly hang around for just one more minute? Because I want to show this tweet because it's a little bit of a humble brag. But about 3 years ago, I noticed that the U.S. and U.S. Media was overwhelmingly engaging in like a campaign where they disparaged the Sinovac.
Disparage. I'm sorry.
Okay. So look at this. About 3 years ago, I saw a lot of articles in the U.S. press saying that the Sinovac, which is made by China, and Sputnik vaccine, which is made by Russia, was not.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah, that the Sinovac vaccine was not effective. Yeah, people act like this was only in the Philippines. I was seeing that way back in 2020 when the Sinovac vaccine was being rolled out. It was being poo-pooed, and the reason for that was because who else was working on vaccines at the time? It was AstraZeneca, it was Pfizer, and Moderna vaccine were being developed at the same time. And if Sinovac was available, if there was an actual effective vaccine that was available, then Westerners would say, well, this vaccine works. Why can't we get it? And what happens is that the U.S. military, but I mean, come on, the U.S. military is not a self-functioning organization. They're obviously getting orders saying, hey, guys, like you have to really make sure that this doesn't spread. Because if Sinovac becomes freely available, and the Chinese were sending Sinovac to every corner of the world that was outside of Western influence. They're sending it to African nations, they're sending it to Asian nations, etc., to South America. But what the West wants to do is then to privatize this and then give the profits to these vaccine makers, to the big pharma. So for the people that were saying that big pharma is poised to profit off of this, yes, they absolutely did. Did they fast forward through the testing process before we had ensured that the vaccines were absolutely safe? Yeah, they absolutely did that too. So the reason that we have all of this, the reason that we have like 4 different vaccines, the reason that you have to like book your vaccination at a clinic that might have your favorite vaccine of choice, whether it's Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, etc. As a matter of fact, AstraZeneca, that ended up getting removed from the approved list of vaccines. It did here in Canada. I'm not sure what it was in the United States, but AstraZeneca was absolutely removed off of the list of approved vaccines.
It was
here.
removed in some countries in Europe too.
Yeah, and the reason that we ended up having to go through that is because we didn't want the Chinese vaccine makers to be able to get access to these low cost, if not, I mean, in some countries it was free vaccines, because we wanted to put the profits of big pharma first.
Yep. So that's what I wanted to cover. And I guess that's all for this week. Thank you for joining us. And somebody also said, great guest.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Well,
feel free to have me back on anytime. I'm always happy to drop by.
Oh, that'd be great. Okay. So with that, I will say I'll be flying next week, so we won't have a show next week, but I'll be back in 2 weeks. So with that, bye-bye.
All right. Sounds good. See you, Risha.